you've already said that the Grail is the heart of the matter, and you've started to say some things about what you believe the Grail to be, and talked about some of like the various competing interpretations of it. But for you, what is the Grail?
Right. Well, that's both in one sense easy and in one sense impossible to answer.
Welcome to Grail Country. My guest today is Malcolm Guite. This has been a long time in the making, but we finally managed to find a date that worked for both of us. I've been talking about having a conversation with Malcolm for a while. My guest today, Malcolm Guite, is an Anglican priest, poet, and musician whose works include The Singing Bowl, David's Crown, Waiting on the Word, Mariner, Lifting the Veil, and Merlin's Isle and Arthurian Volume 1, Galahad on the Grail, which is coming out in spring of 2026, and many, many more. I limited the list to the ones that I either own or intend to own as soon as possible. Malcolm,
hello.
Welcome.
Hi,
to Grail. Welcome to Grail Country.
Well, I'm very happy to be on something which has the word Grail at the beginning of it, since I've been dwelling in various ways on the mystery of the Holy Grail. Most of my life, actually, but very intensely more recently in my poetry on it.
Yes. So speaking of most of your life, Malcolm, as I mentioned to you before we started recording, the kind of like internet, like specific internet subculture that I'm a part of, which we call This Little Corner of the Internet, TLC, we have a bit of when we're talking to people for the first time, we have a bit of a conversational liturgy that we follow to kind of allow people to get to know each other a little bit so that you can have a deeper conversation. And so, Malcolm, on that note, tell me a little bit about the home that you grew up in.
So I was actually born in Nigeria, in the town of Ibadan in West Africa. My father was a professor of classics, of Greek and Latin, but he had a great sense of adventure, and so he found himself teaching Latin there, teaching Greek and Latin, but also involved in the Methodist Church there and in lots of other things. So I was there, and then, although we came back to England by sea each year, and then I was briefly for 3 years or so in Zimbabwe, as it is now, Rhodesia as it was then. Then eventually my dad, we had some time in Cambridge. My dad got a job in Canada. So I was a Canadian teenager for a while, from like 67 to kind of 71. But then my dad sent me back to school in England, at a boarding school, and eventually I won a scholarship to Cambridge, and I've been there or thereabouts ever since. But I grew up in a household which was both full of books, written books on the shelves, but also full of poetry and song. My mother is Scottish. I'm half Scottish, and all her people are Scottish. And my grandmother was a published poet in Scotland. And my mother had an immense fund of poetry, which she just naturally flowed out of her. So I grew up in an atmosphere where there was poetry around all the time. And I think the poetic side of me comes down from my mother's side, I think.
So were you raised Methodist then?
Yes, I was. Yeah, my father was. So my first years we were at Methodist churches, and when we went to Canada, actually, my dad, partly because of you have to imagine we moved there in 67 and then into the late 60s. My father, who was a very radical Christian and a radical pacifist and had been a conscientious objector in the war, actually found himself naturally gravitating to the Quakers in Canada. So actually we went to Quaker meeting then, partly because Dad was involved in the kind of various protests against the Vietnam War and trying to work for peace issues internationally. So it was Methodist and then it was Quaker. I mean, perhaps everybody does this to some degree. Maybe you need distance to get perspective or something, but like, I suppose quite a lot of kids brought up in Christian households, I explored all the other alternatives and sort of rebelled against it as a teenager. And for a brief while I was in England at school, I thought I was a fairly convinced atheist. But again, poetry opened the imagination in such a way that I couldn't have I tried to embrace but could not maintain a completely reductive view of the world where everything is just a chemical reaction and doesn't matter or mean anything, and there's a reductive material explanation for everything. I found the experience of poetry couldn't be reduced in that way.
Yeah.
And eventually, in my second year as a student of English literature at Cambridge, I came back to faith. It was fairly natural for me to be Anglican at that point because the college chapels were Anglican, and also I mean, this is probably of some relevance to the Grail. The core of it, the heart of what brought me back, was the notion of sacrament, and especially the sacrament of Holy Communion. So I needed to be in a church where sacraments were central, and so that's the church I found myself in. I was confirmed as an Anglican in 1980 in my final year at university. But my father was just delighted I became a Christian again. I mean, my father would have been happy for me too. He was very ecumenical. He worked ecumenically on peace issues. We had a lot with many other churches. So, but that's the church I've found a home in. And I've been an Anglican ever since. And in 1990, so 10 years after my adult confirmation, I was ordained first a deacon and then a priest in the Church of England.
I'm kind of an accidental Anglican myself, so I can identify with that. I was raised Pentecostal, but eventually ended up landing.
No, I mean, Anglicanism made huge sense to me because my path back into faith was very much through the deep English poetic tradition. And obviously, poets like John Donne and George Herbert were extraordinarily important to me. And later Coleridge, who was also became a communicant Anglican in the second half of his life. So, yeah, that was a very good, still is a very good home for me. Though I think we take the divisions, the denominational drawing of lines, far too seriously. I mean, yes. I take it that if there's one Christ, there's one body of Christ, and that the church is not coterminous with the lines of any one denomination. You know, I was rather like, I think there's the phrase in the Magnificat where Mary says, "You've scattered the proud in the imagination of their hearts." I think it is only to use a less important term of imagination, it's in the vain or empty imaginings that we think we're separate. Actually, we're not.
Yeah, absolutely. Wholeheartedly agree with that one. Okay, so Malcolm, can you tell me a little bit, this kind of like connects to like your background too. Do you remember the first time you actually encountered the Arthurian material, and in what form?
Oh, yes, very vividly. And it was almost at a sort of pre-literate stage for me. I was still quite a small boy when my mother began to tell me the stories of King Arthur and the Knights of the Round Table. And she did this. I have to say, my mother is also a woman of very considerable intellect as well as imagination. And she's a historian. And she was very well acquainted with Malory in particular. She knew the Malory text intimately. And so she began to tell me Arthur stories, and I loved them. And like everybody, you kind of try to wonder which of the knights you might most closely identify with. And for me, even from quite a young age, it was Galahad rather than Lancelot. I mean, I recognize the type that Lancelot is, obviously full of prowess and deeds of daring do. He's the kind of person who would be the sort of captain of the rugby team at school, and I would never have been that. But Galahad, there was clearly something. Galahad clearly had a sense of awe and the numinous, and his adventures seemed to me to have this spiritual resonance. And maybe I discerned that was more likely to be my path anyway. So when I played at Knights of the Round Table, which I did, I had a wooden sword and a shield, which my mother made beautiful cloth covers for with heraldic emblems on them, and she sort of knitted me a kind of shirt of silver mail and everything. But when I was playing at Knights of the Round Table, I was always playing at being Galahad. So I had it that. Then, of course, like a lot of people of my generation, the first proper retelling of it, that was accessible to me as a child, but which I still read and which I'm using a great deal even for my own work now, was Roger Lancelin Green's very beautiful retelling, King Arthur and the Knights of the Round Table, which came out in Puffin Books, which were the children's version of Penguin, in the very early 50s. And in fact, the copy I'm using now is sort of 53 and was actually belonged to my wife, who also was being brought up with those stories. So that was how the tale took shape. I was thrilled later in life to discover that Roger Lancelin Green had been a particular friend of C.S. Lewis's, and Lewis had been around when he was working on that. Of course, he and Walter Hooper wrote the first biography of Lewis together. So since I've become very interested in how all the Inklings work with the Arthurian material, in fact, I wrote the concluding chapter for a book called The Inklings and Arthur, which was a wide collection of essays on that. So yeah, Roger Lancelin Green was next. And then Tennyson. I love Tennyson's poetry, so I read the kind of high, grand blank verse of the Idylls of the King. At some point, I picked up, probably in my mid-teens to late teens, I picked up T.H. White's The Sword in the Stone, which I kind of both liked and disliked simultaneously. It was great writing and very highly readable. And I really like the attention that he pays to Arthur's upbringing and nurture, simply because Malory doesn't do that at all. And neither really does Lancelin Green, or Tennyson for that matter. And he invents one. But there's a constant rib digging and sort of satire on English society, and having the knights as though they were sort of bluff squires, and describing jousting as though it was the equivalent of hunting, shooting and fishing, and the whole notion of Merlin living backwards through time. So Merlin is constantly alluding to sort of railway trains and that kind of thing. I found that tiresome after a while, because I wanted to be enchanted. And that kind of knowing, learned joking, to my mind, constantly broke the enchantment. Sometimes he forgot to do that, and he could write long passages like the transformation of Arthur into a fish, for example. Which is
that's what I was just going to ask about, because that's part of this.
So I read it and just got through the annoyance of the kind of wisecracks. A lot of the wisecracks that T.H. White is making are intended to go over the head of his younger readers. And I don't think that's an honest way to deal with your young reader. I think your young reader and you must be absolutely on a level, and you must write what you would like to read, and you hope they would like to read, and you must speak to them, as it were, man to man. I think that's why Lewis's books are so good, is there's not the slightest hint of his patronizing his readers. Whereas I just feel slightly, I mean, I think T.H. White is, brilliant as he is almost too clever for his own good. He's always kind of looking over your head at somebody else.
So that was one of the early encounters for me as well. I think I was 10 when I read T.H. White for the first time. And I had been, like you, my memories of exposure to the Arthurian material are pre-literate. Like my mother read to me from Tales of Arthur and His Knights, and she let me watch the musical Camelot with her. And so I think perhaps because Camelot draws heavily from T.H. White. So like the Arthur that the kind of version that of Merlin and Arthur that is presented in the musical Camelot is definitely taken straight from T.H. White. Like,
I think obviously White changes as he goes on, as you go on in the narrative.
Right.
It gets quite a lot darker.
Yeah.
Which in a way is true to Malory. I mean, he obviously knows Malory back to front, and a lot of the jokes are jokes you only get if you already know Malory.
Right.
But and eventually, of course, probably by the time I was in my early 20s, late teens, early 20s, studying English literature, I sat down and read Malory, and I found that far more satisfying in a way than anything else. But that was probably because it took me back to my mother. I mean, to give you what I think I would want to emphasize, my mother, even though she was telling stories from memory to and from a very prodigious memory to a boy of 8 or 9, or to begin with, much younger, 5 or 6, she didn't bowdlerize or sanitize it. And in particular, the thing I most remember, I would have been a little bit older. She probably saved this till I was probably about 8 or 9. So we're talking, mid 60s. She told me the whole story of Balin and the dolorous stroke or the dolorous blow. And she told it incredibly vividly. And she really built up the sense as he's fleeing Pelles, you know, in the castle, weaponless, and he's going from chamber to chamber, of the sense of penetrating closer to a numinous, a sacred mystery, and the door, the words, you know, the voice at the door saying, "Don't come in, unclean." And then, you know, his seeing both the Grail and the spear. And this awful moment when he seizes the spear of Longinus and wounds the king, and then the whole castle falls down. And then she said that this is the most striking memory for me. She explained about how Merlin comes after 3 days and sort of rescues Balin from the ruins, but then tells him what he's done, that he's not only wounded the king, his host, and brought the castle down, but that he has brought absolute devastation and waste and a complete you know, killing of the life and fertility of of 3 counties, as it were. And I remember my mother describing to me how he had to ride out on his horse through this desolate land with the people coming to their doors of these, you know, ruinas, cursing him because of what he's done. And I can remember saying to my mum, but that's terrible. How could one thing done by one person, you know, didn't entirely know what he was doing, how could it have such massive consequences, not only for everyone, but all the fish laid in the rivers, and the wheat was poisoned in the land, and nothing would grow the following spring. I said, how could that even happen? And I can remember her saying to me, well, we live in a terrible and perilous world where decisions make a difference. And she said, I need to tell you, you know, you're old enough to know this. You live in such a world. And this was not long after the Cuban Missile Crisis, of course. And she said, we live in a world where now somebody like Balin, notwithstanding warning voices, could unleash such a devastation that it would make a wasteland for generations, not just of 3 counties, but of the whole inhabited world. And that was my first conscious awareness of what was a terrible thing hanging over us all in those days, of the threat of nuclear war. And it came to me through the Arthur. So one of the things that immediately taught me was that this book is about life as it is now. This is, you know, now I think I would say later on when I was rereading Mallory, I interpreted the wasteland more in terms of ecological devastation and the ecological crisis. Now, when I'm coming to write it all myself, I'm interpreting it in terms of the real crisis, which is behind the ecological crisis, which is the disenchantment, so-called disenchantment of nature, the reduction of nature to mere an agglomeration of neutral stuff that we can do what we like. Rather
that sense is actually kind of why my channel is called Grail Country, because the Grail Country channel comes out of this what is the genesis of the kind of internet subculture that I'm part of is concerned with the meaning crisis. And so it's concerned with the meaning crisis, which is precisely the disenchantment that you're talking about.
Yeah, I mean, the person who's really analyzed that brilliantly and completely put his finger on it was another friend of C.S. Lewis's, Owen Barfield.
Yes.
He's got an essay. He's got a whole collection of essays called something like The Crisis of Meaning. But there's an essay called The Coming Trauma of Materialism, where he says, how is it that the more and more we can find out about the world, the less and less it means to us? And he sees the crisis of meaning as fundamental, as I do too. But I think there's good news. I mean, people now talk, and I'm very sympathetic to those who talk about re-enchanting nature. But I don't think we have to re-enchant nature. I think nature is already enchanted. We have to kind of undisenchant ourselves, as it were. We have to recover this earlier view. And that's partly why I think the Grail legends are so important.
Yeah, Barfield says that participation never goes fully away. If that were the case, then there wouldn't be any hope.
No, exactly so.
Yeah.
And he says poetry is precisely one of the ways in which we recover a little of what original participation was, and perhaps move towards what he hopes for and calls final participation.
Right.
And he says in his book on poetic diction that that the full experience of poetry involves a change of consciousness. In fact, his friend C.S. Lewis added a word to that when he was hearing the book in manuscript. He said it involves a felt change of consciousness.
Mm-hmm.
And that's very much why, as well as wanting to, I've always thought I'd love to retell the Arthur stories, but why Contra Mundum, I've decided to do it as an extended poem. I mean, obviously, nobody's written a long narrative poem for about a century. And as I said to various publishers and eventually to Rabbit Room, I said, you know, the unique selling point that this is the first epic poem for a century or two might also be the unique sinking point, you know, because there might be a reason why.
Or it might be counterintuitively, this might be precisely the moment for it.
Well, I'm hoping so.
Because I think, well, that's what I mean. That's connected to the whole thing I said about like why it was called Grail country. There's a sense in which it's like the arrival of that wasteland is it is a herald of something that is going to begin a transformation. So, I think that makes it. So to me, it makes the time right for something like that.
I'm beginning to think so. I think we're at the cusp. I think the Enlightenment project, having deconstructed everything else, is now in the process of deconstructing itself. And I think that the project, in that sense, the idea, you know, the Cartesian dualism that the only thinking stuff is in here and everything out there is dead. I think that's challenged on many levels in science as well as in the arts. I think that you know, Charles Taylor's masterly analysis of the whole thing, and even his coining of the phrase "the immanent frame," about the way we see things now. If you have an immanent frame, it implies it's only a frame and that there is a transcendence possible. I think Ian McGilchrist's work is really pertinent to all of this. So I think we may be on the cusp of a recovery of a much better, more of an integration of imagination back into reason, but also, if you like, a more personal, communitarian and courteous relationship with the world around us and with the supposedly inanimate things with which we have to do.
Absolutely. So, what was the deciding factor for you to decide to take on this Arthurian project that you're working on? Like, what was the deciding factor for, like, okay, Malcolm, need to pick up my pen and make my own contribution to this tradition?
Yeah. Well, as you can imagine, because it was both such a big project and such a project that was so personally important to me, and also tied up intimately with deep memories of my mother and so on, I naturally, because of its importance and its size, I kept putting it off. I kept thinking, you know, now is not the time, I'll do this sometime. But a combination, one of the problems I saw was the problem of form. I mean, the examples I had before me, you know, of the last 2 centuries, there was Tennyson, but that high blank verse, sort of slightly sub-Miltonian, I just didn't think I wanted to do that. Then there was Charles Williams, a lyric cycle, but to be honest, he's still in a very high modernist mode with his friend Eliot and co. And it's kind of, it needs somebody to explain it. You know, it had to be bristling with footnotes. I think the finest writer who's used it, you know, poetically or prose poetically, is David Jones. But again, if you pick up David Jones' Anathemata or in parenthesis, or even the more specifically Arthurian, the Sleeping Lord, it is quite literally bristling with footnotes, and it's written in about 3 or 4 languages. And there was a time when I thought, oh, I too must write like a high modernist. And then something in me knew that wasn't, I wanted to write something, certainly I wanted to write something profound, but I wanted to write something approachable and lucid and readable to a young reader that's not going to. Meantime, as I thought separately, I was doing a big project on Coleridge, who is really the great inspirer in many respects of Owen Barfield, and who absolutely saw this consciousness problem That's right at the core of his work. Now, I wrote a long book called Mariner, A Voyage with Samuel Taylor Coleridge, in which I used Coleridge's Rime of the Ancient Mariner really as a lens through which to see not only Coleridge's own life, but the modern crisis. And of course, that's written in ballad form, and it's highly readable. But what he's done is taken the old ballad form, the pre-literate ballad form, and turned it with all his literary skill into this infinitely flexible instrument. And he varies the verse forms and so on. And I was writing, critically appreciative things of this. And then quite independently, I had an email, in fact, from the Rabbit Room Press, asking me to contribute to a book called The Lost Tales of Galahad, where you had to take the Galahad as we find him in Malory. But because Malory says that there were adventures he had that were never written down, you had to write a new adventure with that character, but in any style you like. And I had to, for some reason, I think it was literally it's procrastination, in fact, which paradoxically makes people productive, because the things you do to procrastinate turn out to be the best things you do anyway. So I think I had to fill in a long tax form, and I really didn't fancy it. So I had this email. So I sat down to write a quick, as I thought, quite light ballad of a story I made up myself called Galahad and the Naiad. And I suddenly found the ballad form absolutely flowed. All that work on Coleridge had obviously tuned my mind and the meter in my mind to it. And then the thing became longer and more significant than I thought it would be. So by the time I'd finished it and sent it off to Rabbit Room, and it's been published in this book, The Lost Tale of Galahad, I suddenly realized I had found the form I needed. And at that point, which was about 4 years ago, I think, I thought, right, I can put this off no longer. I was in any case about to make, for different reasons, but I was beginning to feel that my vocation as a poet was was a part of my vocation as a priest. It was both, but that I wasn't giving enough time to it. So this was back in about 2020. I took early retirement. I mean, I could still be carrying on in my Cambridge college, and it would be very nice, but I just thought I need to walk away from these comforts and this security, and I need to be a bard properly. So and then of course lockdown came at exactly the same time, which is very good for writing, if not good for other things. So all these factors came together, and my original plan was just to write the Grail, because that seemed to me the heart of the matter, and then publish it, and then see if anybody liked it, and if there was a demand for it, then I would do the rest. But then, of course, I had to work out how the Grail fitted into the rest, and I ended up, because I'm, I follow Aristotle, and for that matter, Homer and Virgil and Spencer and Milton, in thinking that an epic ought to consist of 12 books, which I decided could work in 4 volumes. And by the time I'd worked out the plan, I thought, well, I might as well do the whole thing, but I'll still start with the Grail. And then Rabbit Room came on board. They totally got it. They totally got the vision, what I was trying to do. They saw that it needed to be a beautiful hardback book, with lovely woodcut illustration. I asked for Stephen Crotts, who I think is just a great illustrator, and they said, yeah, Stephen would love to do it. And he's really got the vision for it. So at that point, I thought, well, I'm actually committed to do the whole thing now. I mean, at the time, I was obviously at the beginning of lockdown, and before the vaccine had been developed, we were all, and particularly me, because I have type 2 diabetes and was generally considered a bit at risk, we were all considering our mortality. And I actually thought I may not live to complete this, but at the very least I should do the Grail, which I have now done. I've completed that volume, but I'm now writing the rest of it. So yeah, it all suddenly came, and it was very much like as though there was a huge charge of poetic force waiting in me to do this. So once I started, it wasn't hard at all. I realized I'd been thinking about this actually since I was a small boy, so, right. And of course I was partly trying to recover. I mean, Coleridge says somewhere that he defines a poet as a person who brings the vision of the child into the powers of the adult. So, and I'm very much both writing for my younger self and for the, I'm hoping to write a poem which will be satisfying to serious Arthurian aficionados who've read all the sources and will see therefore what I'm doing with them. but I didn't want it, as I say, to be bristling with footnotes, although I am doing appendices rather in the manner of the Lord of the Rings, so that like,
Oh, okay.
like me who want to know exactly what I'm doing and why I didn't do this and what's going on there and which source I used and all that sort of stuff. And I've got an essay on the wasteland and all of that kind of thing. So I'm doing that, but I'm trying to make the poem itself the kind of thing that literally the parents could read to kids. Probably they need to be 9 or 10 rather than 4 or 5, and that teenagers could pick up and read to themselves and enjoy. The sort of readers of The Hobbit and The Lord of the Rings, that's the kind of readership I'm after.
I think it's arriving just in time. I can remember seeing a social media post from a college professor the other day, who was reporting that only 3 out of 14 students in his class had any familiarity with King Arthur, Camelot, or the Grail.
Really?
Yeah.
But in a way, that's good, because I mean, obviously, I was also, I didn't want to do any of the Hollywood versions, and I wanted to, in a sense, also, if you like, to de-Disneyfy it. I mean, I'm looking for, I want to kindle a sense of the numinous. I mean, it might be one of the things I did when I took a deep breath and thought, okay, I've written Galahad and the Naiad, that could be part of it eventually, but now I see my way forward to do the whole Grail cycle. So I kind of felt called to it, really, and I walked out one morning and composed whilst walking a short kind of poem, an introductory poem, which was about the vocation to do it. I'm wondering if actually it might be worth just reading you that.
Of course, welcome. It's always worth it to have you read us poetry.
It'll give you an idea also of the kind of style, but something of what I'm trying to achieve as well. So I'll read you this. It's the prelude. It's just called "Take Up the Tale." As I walked out one morning, all in the soft, fine rain, it seemed as though a silver veil was shining over hill and vale, as though some lovely long-lost spell had made all new again. And through that shimmer in the air, I seemed to hear a sound, as though a distant horn were blown in some lost land that I had known, that seemed to speak from tree and stone and echo all around. And with the music came these words, "Poet, take up the tale. Take up the tale this land still keeps. In earth and water magic sleeps. The dryad sighs, the naiad weeps, but you can lift the veil. From where the waves wash Cornwall's caves, out to the White Horse Vale, the lands still hold the tale of old, like hidden treasure, buried gold. Once more the story must be told. Poet, take up the tale. Tell of the king who will return. Tell of the Holy Grail. Tell of old knights and chivalry. Tell of the pristine mystery of Merlin's Isle of Gramarye. Poet, take up the tale. Take up the tale of courtesy. Take up the tale of grace. Revive the land's long memory. Summon the fair folk. Let them be. Something of fairy, wild and free, still lingers in this place. Lift up your eyes to see the light on Glastonbury Tor. Then come down from that far green hill to where the sacred waters spill and shine within the chalice well, and listen to their lore. Yea, listen well before you start. Be still ere you begin. See through the surface roundabout, the noise, the rush, the fear, the doubt. Though modern Britain lies without, fair Logres lives within. You may yet walk through Merlin's Isle, by oak and ash and thorn. The ancient hills do not forget, and you might wake their wisdom yet. Who knows what wonders might be met on this midsummer morn? So I have taken up the tale, to tell it full and free, the tale that makes my heart rejoice. I tell it, for I have no choice. I tell it, till another voice takes up the tale from me.
Beautiful.
So that's the kind of, program or the
Yeah. It's interesting. Do I detect a little bit of a nod to Barfield's The Silver Trumpet there in that opening?
Yeah, and also Barfield's the whole idea of there's a nod to that, and there's also a nod. There's quite a strong nod to the passage, which I find so moving at the end of Lewis's novel, That Hideous Strength, which of course is an Arthurian novel and involves
yes,
the
it
revenge
is.
and so on. So you may remember that they have this conversation about what he calls a good haunting.
Yeah.
That, as it were, there is something genuinely mystical. I mean, we had the great privilege of once in the ancient world of being the very end of the world. I mean, we were always a mysterious island, the Druids always. Everybody understood there was something quintessentially magical about these islands. And it's as though, from the time of the Industrial Revolution, we've been trying to forget that good dream and stamp on it. But it keeps breaking through in odd places, and it kind of broke through in the Romantic poets and so on. So he has this idea of the difference between Britain and Logres, Britain being where the kind of utilitarian Thomas Gradgrind, Locke and Hume and all of that. And Logres being this kind of mystical root of it. So my belief is that actually it's modern mechanistic materialism, which is the thin veneer that's been put over on the surface of something which has great depth and mystery about it. I mean, the whole business of being alive is a deep one where, all of us move on the surface of mysteries we can scarcely comprehend, but we've made the mistake of thinking the surface is all there is. So that see through the surface roundabout, the fear, the rush, the noise, that out there modern Britain lies without, fair Logres lives within. And I was very careful in my choice of the word lies there. I was summoning both the sense that it lies all about us, but that it is a tissue of lies, which is also something that Blake felt very strongly. And Blake is another influence on me. I mean, Blake didn't write an Arthurian, although of course he could have done, but he, when Blake was learning the art of engraving and drawing, he was set to copy all these statues and memorials in Westminster Abbey. But when he was 14, they finally let him do a picture of his own composition, and he could do whatever he liked. It's the first thing we have of Blake that's not just a copy of something else. And what is it? It's Joseph of Arimathea among the rocks of Cornwall.
Yeah. Absolutely.
So that whole, I'm interested not just in the Grail story as it is told from the moment that the Grail appears mysteriously at Camelot and they vow to go on the quest. I'm interested in the very long backstory of the Grail, which obviously goes back to the Last Supper.
Because there are basically there are two kinds of Grail stories. You have the Grail stories that are about the quest, the nightly quest for the Grail, and then you have the Grail stories that actually get into the back history.
Now, of course, it's more complicated than that. And this is, I think, something of real moment. As the 19th century proceeded, you had this kind of double movement. On the one hand, you had the Romantics trying to look back and feel there was a real kindling of something actual and beautiful, and you had Romantic medievalizing on the other. On the other hand, you had sort of social anthropologists and authors of books on comparative religion, of whom the greatest and most famous was Fraser, who wrote The Golden Bough, who were really saying that, there are certain archetypal things that just manifest in all kinds of religions, and that in every form of paganism there is a dying and rising God, and because it's to do with the seed going down. And they, if you like, tried to explain away the particular mysteries of Christianity as being another example of one of these things. And where of course they were perfectly right about dying and rising gods everywhere, and they're perfectly right about great fertility ceremonies in which a king was wedded to the land and perhaps died in order to go into the land, and all of that. They were perfectly right about that. But you don't have to say therefore, there's nothing particular about Christianity, because another way of saying it is that's why Christianity is the shape it is, because it's the meaning and fulfillment of all these other things. These things which are all admittedly mythological,
right,
actually, without losing any of their mythic resonance, become historical as well. And that's the view that Tolkien and Lewis took. But this has had a real effect, as I'm sure you know, on Arthurian studies. The classic case in point is Jessie Weston's book, From Ritual to Romance, which is the book that influenced Eliot to call his poem The Wasteland. There's directly Arthurian reference there. He locates the whole poem, if you like, at a certain point of the waste caused by the dolorous stroke of blood. But Jessie Weston really to do with an old ritual of sacrifice of a wounded king, and if the king is wounded, the land is wounded, and you need a special ritual vessel in which you can, and a special ritual spear in order to heal the king. And then she thinks this has just been given a lightly Christianized gloss in the Arthurian sources, but it's really a Celtic pre-Christian religion. So there's been great, and then
right,
in the sadly unpublished book, The Figure of Arthur, that Charles Williams was going to write, he attacks this head on, or tackles it, and says, look, it's not a thin Christian gloss. This is a thoroughly Christian text. But that doesn't mean it's not engaged with these. So part of obviously we were living in an age of there is a very strongly neo-pagan movement around us. And in many respects, I have a great deal of sympathy with it, because it seems to me 100% better than mere materialism. And
yeah. Lewis shared that sentiment.
Lewis says exactly that in A Cliche Come Out of Its Cage. But my view, and I've read most of the medieval sources, so I think this is a scholarly view. It's not just I would say that because I'm an Anglican priest. I genuinely think it's the case, is that the really exciting thing that's going on in the Arthurian material is that these stories, these pre-Christian stories, and you can see them in figures like the Lady of the Lake and the Green Knight and everybody, are brought into contact with the equally deep mystery of the sacramental vision of the world and of the holy, and of the mystery of Holy Communion, and we see them interact. And what we see is that some things are, as it were, won't take, as it were, but other things make huge sense of the Grail. So it's an exploration of, for my mind, my whole approach to this is very much like the approach that Paul took, when he was taken to Athens. And at first he thought, oh golly, I'm an Orthodox Jew and there's all these statues, yuck. But then the Spirit worked on him, and when he finally spoke, you may remember he said, men of Athens, I see in every way you are very religious. For as I saw the objects of your worship, I saw this statue to an unknown God. He whom you worship as unknown, him therefore I preach. So Christ comes as a fulfiller. So I think there's no doubt that all the Arthurian narratives, certainly the Kester Sangreal, it's arguable that some of the German ones, and it's arguable that the first Percival stories, it's not clear. Chrétien de Troyes never finished it. It's not clear whether the Grail is the cup of communion, and it's pronounced, it's written differently, and it's a gradus, it's a dish rather than a cup, and in one version of the story it's a stone. So there's plenty of talk about that.
Yeah, it's a stone in Wolfram's version.
Yeah, in Wolfram von Eschenbach, that's right. But nevertheless, by the time you get to the highest presentation of it, which is the Galahad story, it's clearly the Holy Grail. But because it's the Holy Grail doesn't mean it's not also those other things. It's those other things coming to find what they really mean. So that's my approach. But I'll tell you a really interesting thing. Because I was in that sense trying to re-sacralize, but re-sacralize as a deeply Christian sacrament, the Grail, notwithstanding I've read the other mystical things, but I was trying to focus it. I thought, boy, I'm going to be in trouble with the sort of neo-pagan retellers of this story, And then lo and behold, having read a few bits of it on my YouTube, I got an email from Martin Shaw, and I thought, okay, this is it. But far from him saying, you bloody Christians trying to steal this back, he said, I love what you're doing, and I like the storytelling, which is amazing, because I thought that, I've been to some degree mastered the sonnet form, but I'm like a beginner learning a new craft, writing a narrative poem. But he said, I like your storytelling. And they said, can you come and see me sometime? And I said, yeah, I'd love to, Anyway, we met up, we became friends. But in fact, it turns out, as you may know, he was on a journey deep into Christianity and I may have had a small part in that I read him the Lewis poems about that and talked to him about Lewis and Tolkien. But I mean, that was going to happen anyway. God had his hands on that man. So now he's doing in his own way the same thing that I'm doing. And I took that as an immense encouragement. That the kind of direction in which I was trying to nudge the telling of this story was already being taken by some of the great tellers of that tale. And I would count Martin Shaw as one of the great tellers of that tale. So, in fact, I'm going to be doing a thing with him later on this month.
Wonderful.
Devon, we're going to do a thing on the Grail.
Yeah, Martin is a friend of mine as well. He's been on the channel. We talked about his book, The Snowy Tower, which is his telling of Parsifal.
Yeah. So anyway, I counted his sort of our meeting and our sense of being really kindred spirits. That was a huge achievement. Now it's probably the other way around.
I would be remiss if I did not comment on that a little bit about the kindred spirits. To me, there's a way in which both of you represent aspects of Merlin's character. Like Martin Shaw has a bit of the druidic wild Merlin to him.
Yeah.
Whereas you remind me kind of, although I know you have mixed feelings about T.H. White's work, T.H. White's Merlin, there's very much something about you that is reminiscent of T.H. White's Merlin.
Donish, as we would say, and I am I'm a Cambridge Don, so
yeah, right.
That's what it is. No, I think that's I think probably both Martin and I mean, we'd both be immensely complimented to embody any aspect of Merlin at all.
And you're both poets too,
but I think, anyway, I just felt a real sense of the wind blowing in the same direction, as it were, and of a shift and a turn of the tide, perhaps culturally, of which he and I might be part, and therefore of which my work might be part. And that was very exciting, because I would write this anyway. If nobody bought it, I think I would now write it just for the satisfaction of having completed it, even if it just sat in dusty corners. And there was a sort of weird oddment, a kind of, strange literary dead end that Guite went down. But I now begin to hope that it might not be that at all, and that we might be in the midst of good changes, and this might be part of that. I mean, the other thing I should mention about that little prelude poem I read you, when take up the tale, the land still keeps. The tale already exists. One has to approach it with a certain amount of humility. One is part of a tradition. One develops the tradition, but one only makes a small contribution. So it's very important at the end of that prelude poem is, I tell it till another voice takes up the tale from me. And I see this, all of us any of us who dare to tell or retell any aspect of the matter of Britain, as it was called, are only parts of a tradition, and we have to both honor the tradition and also recognize that our aim, in some sense, is for somebody else to take what we've done and develop it in a different way.
Yeah. So you kind of you've already kind of started to answer this question, but I'm going to go ahead and ask it directly anyway, since you've already said that the Grail is the heart of the matter, and you've started to say some things about what you believe the Grail to be, and talked about some of like the various competing interpretations of it. But for you, what is the Grail?
Right. Well, that's both in one sense easy and in one sense impossible to answer. So I think the Grail, at the most literal and historical level, is indeed the chalice of the Last Supper, and of which Jesus said, this is my body, this is my blood. So, but that itself is kind of a new, every Eucharist, I think, is itself an a moment of miraculous incarnation. However, Jesus Christ is also the Logos, in whom and through whom all things were made. He's the cosmic Christ, as well as the person who meets us as the carpenter of Nazareth. He's fully God and fully human. And therefore, what he does and what he says and what he touches and how he transforms what he touches has cosmic significance. Now, in the Grail, we have a very beautiful thing in the Eucharist, and comparatively recently, was we when we bring the bread and the wine to the altar, we talk about that this is bread which earth has given and human hands have made, and this is the fruit of the vine which earth has given and human hands have made. It will become our spiritual drink. So what we see in the Grail in the chalice is, in fact, a meeting of heaven and earth. And I think that means all of heaven and all of earth. And the very shape of a chalice is itself a meeting point. Something from below is coming up. Something from above is coming below, and they're meeting, as it were, at the base of the bowl of the chalice. But it also has a stem. Yeah. And there is one sense in which one of the things I think that happens with the Grail and the Achievement of Grail is that the whole of earth is lifted up to heaven through that, and the whole of heaven comes down to earth through that in that meeting. That's what's happening. And that means that everything, that means woods, waters, fields, farms, rocks, the furthest, all of that is involved when we make Eucharist. When we make Eucharist, it's not some private little pious thing I'm doing with the top corner of my mind. It's an event of cosmic significance. In fact, there's only one event. I think all the different occasions on which we do it are like portals in time into this single central thing, which is a fulfillment of what the creation was for. So there's not only, when you celebrate the Eucharist, on the one hand, you look back to the Last Supper, and you would do this in remembrance of thee. But on the other hand, you look forward to the eschaton, to the complete new heaven and new earth, which in a sense is being anticipated and bodied forth a little for you. So you can't, the Grail, the actual particular, and this is the candle of particularity. It's like saying God Almighty was a little baby. All these things are there in this one vessel, but they're there in the vessel, and yet the vessel contains, it's like the TARDIS, it's much bigger on the inside than it is on the outside. And nobody at any one moment of receiving the Eucharist, even in an ordinary parish church, let alone in the Grail Castle, with the Grail, nobody's ever individually going to get all of that, which is why we have communion with each other. We share, because the other thing that's going on is the blood of Christ is flowing in our veins, and his body is in our body, and we are in him, lifted up to heaven, and he is in us, brought down to earth and embodied. So I was, when I was writing all the things, when I thought, when we finally get to the Grail Castle and we have, what is mysteriously called the achievement of the Grail, how am I even going to do this? Like, how can I even begin to approach this? And partly in the poem, I asked that question. And here again, Charles Williams, who I think is a really great mystical writer, comes to my aid. I mean, all Charles Williams's novels are brilliant. They're all flawed, but they're still brilliant. And they all have golden moments that you'd never want to lose, even if they've also got quite a lot of bathos and sort of creaky plots. Nevertheless, his early-ish, comparatively early novel, which is his Grail novel, The War in Heaven, which involves a mild-mannered archdeacon finding the Holy Grail in the back of a church cupboard, and the Grail, being everything that it is, as I've just described it, also brings not so much judgment as revelation. In the presence of the holy object, people discover who they really are. And the evil knows its own evil just as much as the good discovers its own good. And in that novel, the evil guys are trying to get the Grail to use black magic. And there's no doubt in William's mind that if you took such a holy object, you could pervert it, and it would be black magic. So there's real stakes. But at the end of that novel, when the Grail is in a sense restored and the archdeacon celebrates communion with it, by this time you've got Prester John, and you've got it just anyway. There's a brilliant passage where he describes the same event from 2 or 3 different perspectives. So the Catholic aristocrat who's there, who's the kind of slightly Galahadish, well, maybe he's probably maybe he's more of a Percival figure. Anyway, he hears the Mass in Latin. Meanwhile, the other guy in it hears it in Book of Common Prayer, 1660. And somebody else hears it in kind of medieval French, and this idea that to get an idea of what's going on, you need more than one perspective. So when I get to that point in the poem, I ask the question, how can this be described? And then I give first Percival's account of it, and then Bohr's account of it. And they have different perspectives on what it is, you know. And then I give Galahad's account of it. Or I not in Galahad's words, but as it were, in the voice of the omniscient narrator, I give you. But in the end, of course, in that story, only Bors returns to tell the tale. And Bors, in the end, says that he now realizes that the Grail may seem to have been withdrawn with Galahad on the ship, but it's actually only been withdrawn in order to be everywhere. It's the parallel here is with the ascension of Christ into heaven, so that he's but in that sense of what I think the Grail is, there is more than enough room in all those infinitudes becoming realized in this single chalice. There's more than enough room for all the old, the cauldron of Caridwen and the cauldron of generation and you know, the spear of Bron, as well as the, you know, all these things flow into, you know, the spear of Bron flows into the spear of Longinus, all those Celtic cauldrons of plenty where you could never run out. That's there when the Grail provides a banquet for everybody at Camelot. They all belong. The only thing that doesn't belong, which is again part of the story, is the corruption of the mystical into the self-serving power hungriness of magic in the false sense. For Williams, and Williams wrote a great book called Witchcraft where he makes this point very clearly. He says magic in itself might be great or it might be terrible. It depends on whether the adept is coming into a place of worship and letting go and giving glory to that which is glorious, or whether they're seeking power for themselves. And he says a Rosicrucian rite that all the church would think was awful and Gnostical might be pleasing and acceptable to the God who's worshipped in it. And a Eucharist that was used like the forced Eucharists when they you know, the conquistadors made the Native Americans receive at the point of the sword. That's a hellish act, and it's only acceptable to hell, even if technically the liturgy of one was correct and the liturgy of the other was incorrect. So what's repelled by the Grail and judged by the Grail is that desire that we have to make everything serve our end and not be an end in itself.
Yeah, that's as a symbol of the cosmic communion and not necessarily, because of what you just said, not necessarily on a one-to-one ratio with the Christian ritual of communion.
Yeah, I mean, and I'm not obviously by any means the first person to have thought this, and I mean, Coleridge has been a great inspiration to me poetically and in other ways, but I'm very interested in Coleridge's marginalia. He annotated all the books he had, and there was a time when people wouldn't lend the young Coleridge books because he wrote in the margins, and there came a point a few years later when everybody wanted to lend him books because he wrote in the margins. But in his marginalia of his Book of Common Prayer, the marginalia on the communion service, he has an amazing long note where he says, I can think of no better preparation for this sacrament than to read on one's knees, or at least with a kneeling heart, again and again, the prologue to John's Gospel. And then he highlights, in whom all things were made, without him was not anything made that was made. And he brings you out the entire thing. And he says, when we come to communion, we bring all of God's creation with us, everything. And that's part of what he discovered in the Rime of the Ancient Mariner. You know, he prayeth best who loveth best all things both great and small, for the dear Lord he loveth, who loveth us he made and loveth all. Are
you familiar with Bulgakov's The Holy Grail and the Eucharist?
No, I'm not.
Oh, okay. I thought you might be, because I remember one time on your YouTube channel you shared a volume of David Russell Mosley's volume of poetry.
Oh yeah.
And David makes a pretty clear reference to Bulgakov's Holy Grail and the Eucharist in one of the poems, and that.
Oh right,
the one that you read, in fact. And I later had David on here on this channel because that caught my attention when I heard it. because I was familiar with the Holy Grail and the Eucharist, and that was one of the things that David and I talked about. But essentially, just to make it really brief, Bulgakov's Holy Grail and the Eucharist, he's writing an exegesis of John 19:34 about the blood and the water flowing from the side of Christ and then falling to the earth. And then this is to him, like to Bulgakov says that this falling of the blood and water begins the transformation of the earth into what will become the new heaven and the new earth. And that this is really the core of what the Grail is for Bulgakov.
I certainly think the Grail is to do with the new heaven and the new earth. And I very much like the idea, which is in Robert de Boron and others, that Joseph of Arimathea is obviously, because he's going to give his tomb to Christ, he's there at the deposition and he's carrying the chalice and receiving the blood. I mean, not simply from Christ, but from Christ's wounds. The blood and the water is incredibly important as well. I mean, the usual Western patristic reading of that, which is also very good, is that the church is born from the side of Christ because the water is the water of baptism and the blood is the blood of communion. And that this is to do with the very important trope of Christ as the second Adam. And that as the first Adam was put to sleep by God and the Eve was drawn from his side, and there must therefore have been an incision or a wound in the side of Adam, even before the fall, out of which the new creation of Eve sprang. And Eve, of course, at another symbolic level represents the whole earth. So as in her own way Mary does, is the second Eve. So yeah, I think one of the problems, I mean, this is all Christian orthodoxy, but Christians have forgotten it. So one of the problems is that one of the reasons why I think there's been such a spread, and why I'm sympathetic to some degree to the spread of a kind of neo-paganism, is that it's recollecting and keeping stuff that the church used to know as well.
Right.
But has somehow forgotten. But I have to say, because I think Christ is the heart of it, I think paganism, which deliberately excludes Christ, is on a hiding to nothing and will kind of darken in the lives of those who practice it. And therefore it needs, I always like the bit in Lewis has all of this, of course, completely in the Narnia stories, where, in Prince Caspian, Aslan summons both the river god and Bacchus. And the girls have that wonderful romp with Bacchus and his fierce Maenads. But Lucy says, I wouldn't have felt quite safe with Bacchus and his fierce Maenads if Aslan hadn't been there. And Lucy says, I should think not. And Susan says, I should think not. And, so it's bringing these things together again.
Yeah, he does the same thing with with Mars and Venus in his space trilogy too.
Oh, absolutely, yeah.
So yeah. Okay, that's great. Let me check and look at. I had a couple more questions left here. Let's see here. Okay. So actually, I think we've covered the Grail pretty well and your overall project. I did have if you don't mind, I wanted to ask you a couple questions about Merlin. If you're okay with that. Okay.
Yeah.
In the medieval sources, Merlin often has a demonic origin, and yet somehow, despite that demonic origin, he is clearly on the side of good and a Christian man.
Yeah, clearly, because he, in Mallory, he's kind of consulting with the Archbishop of Canterbury about the
but in a lot of modern versions, they kind of that just kind of gets ignored, and Merlin is just unambiguously good from the beginning. I wonder if you think, do we lose anything in modern versions of the story that shy away from the nefarious origins of Merlin that we see in the medieval sources?
Yeah, okay, that's a really interesting one. I mean, the main source for this story, as I understand it, is Geoffrey of Monmouth. And it's really interesting because Geoffrey of Monmouth tells us about the young Merlin. So as you know, the idea is that his mother was a devout nun, but that he had been begotten by, if you like, I forget whether it's an incubus or a succubus, but it's assumed
an incubus.
I can't remember which one was which.
Incubus is the male version, succubus is the female version.
Anyway, but And that this is because the devil plans to imitate the incarnation and to, you know.
Yeah, literally intended to be an antichrist. Yeah,
but this is thwarted because he's baptized, and that is. But he retains, nevertheless, the extra powers from his non-human father. Now that we need a bit more context for this, because the context in which Geoffrey of Monmouth sets that is the story of Vortigern, the then king, trying to build this palace, which falls down. Every time he builds it, it falls down in the night. And he gets all his soothsayers to say, why is this happening? And they say the palace will only stand if the foundation stones are sealed with the blood of a boy who has no earthly father. So then they look for a boy with no earthly father and they come up with Merlin. But then Merlin, being Merlin, says, actually, no, I can show you why your palace is not standing. And if you dig down, you'll find a pool. And in the pool are the two dragons, the red dragon and the white dragon. And then Geoffrey of Monmouth interprets that as the Celts and the Saxons.
Celts and the Saxons, yeah.
So there's all of that. Now, amazingly, Geoffrey of Monmouth, or his unknown sources, don't make much more of that apart from the fact that Merlin's life is saved and he becomes the wizard, as it were, to Vortigern and thence to Uther and thence to Arthur. So he's got he was Arthur's grandfather's wizard,
right,
when he was here. But I think he completely misses a trick here, and I intend to rectify. This is the bit where we get to add to our tradition. I'm going to have Merlin, because he was baptized, I'm going to have the revelation of the dragon. But then when Vortigern orders the death of the previous soothsayers who've told him the story about the blood of a boy with no father, I'm going to have Merlin say, don't kill them. I'll work with them, because they were right, but they were more right than they know. It is absolutely true that not only your own palace, king, but no foundation will stand unless it's founded on the blood of one who was born without a human father. But that person has already been born, and that blood has already been spilled. And one day that blood will come to this country, so we can look forward to the coming of the Grail. That's the way I'm going to handle it.
Oh, that's really good.
So yeah, it's a plot spoiler there, but I haven't written that bit yet. But so I mean, the way Lewis takes this, when he has Merlin respond to that and he says it was not a devil, it was one of the Longavi, one of the middle spirits of the air, which may be where I'll go. I think it's really important that Merlin I see most of Merlin's formation as having been, if you like, druidic, but that his baptism is a real thing. And therefore, when he's able to learn more about it and sees it, he accepts the Christian faith. But he doesn't accept the Christian faith as in any sense displacing the other stuff.
Right.
Again, he sees it as yeah, I mean, it's interesting. I've just been reading the passage in Mallory where it's before the foundation of Camelot, but Arthur goes off against Merlin's advice to fight Pellinore, and on the way he finds these three guys beating up Merlin, but he doesn't know it's Merlin. Merlin is like a little kid that's being beaten up, and he intervenes, and then eventually recognizes Merlin. And the fact that Merlin disguises himself even from Arthur seems to me really important. That Merlin is his own self. He's I mean, obviously to some degree Gandalf is based on Merlin, but one of the most important things I think about Gandalf is that he belongs to another order altogether. And he assists, but even Aragorn would not, even after his coronation, would not presume to tell Gandalf what to do or where to go. He'd consider himself very lucky when Gandalf shows up, but he hasn't got any kind of authority over Gandalf.
Right.
So I see Merlin as one of these characters who appears in a narrative whose authority is of altogether another order. The obvious biblical example is Melchizedek.
Right.
Melchizedek shows up and basically gives Abraham communion avant la lettre. I think like what even happened.
Right.
But it's just a weird thing that happens.
Yeah.
And then the psalm says of Christ to come, thou art a priest forever after the order of Melchizedek. But in Genesis, like, we know nothing about Melchizedek whatsoever. There is absolutely no backstory. There's nothing. He just appears at the right moment and then disappears again. And obviously that's a very kind of useful figure to have in any narrative, but it happens, you know, you get these characters. So I mean, Merlin, of course, one of the traditions about Merlin is that he does indeed have his own master, who's a guy called Blaise, and to whom Merlin eventually tells his story, and Blaise writes the books down. And Tennyson has a discussion between two knights who've retired as hermits, you know, talking about Merlin that way. I'm actually intending to get Taliesin to tell Arthur Merlin's backstory.
Okay.
I mean, Taliesin in one of the Welsh texts, of course, says that he was sometimes called Merlin, and Merlin is a, you know, so you could, you know, but I'm having Taliesin and Merlin as two distinctive characters, neither of whom fit into any of they're neither fully men nor fully elves.
Right.
But they're absolutely familiar with both realms. And they are, if you like, if I were to borrow Tolkien's nomenclature, they are Istari. They're I mean, what Tolkien said that the Istari are kind of incarnate angels. Right. So they're intelligent beings of another order who've taken human form. I don't think that's true. I mean, I think Merlin is, you know, half human, half quasi-angelic being.
Right. Okay. So one last question about Merlin, and we've already kind of referenced it a few times in the conversation. So why exactly do you think that Lewis chooses to have Merlin show up as a character in that hideous strength at the conclusion of his space trilogy? Why Merlin?
Well, I find it both glorious and also slightly disappointing, where there's a bit when Merlin says that the way out of the problem of the night and everything else is to reawaken nature. And he says, just give me an hour or two to walk along the hedgerows. I'm going, go for it. That is the thing to do. That's basically what I want to do. And then, you know, Lewis rather critically says, no, that was probably okay, but maybe not even that okay. In your
yeah. I remember that line. Yes.
But now it's not. I don't buy that. I don't buy the whole idea that things come to more of a point. And I think this is, you know, this is because Lewis loves the paganism so deeply that he's a little bit afraid of loving it too much. So he has to have his Pendragon sort of wag the finger at Merlin. But actually, I would have liked Merlin to have just carried on. You know, I think that would have been good.
Yeah, absolutely.
But I think he has to bring Merlin back, partly to make a point that he makes at great length in his book on English literature, non-dramatic in the 16th century, which is about the way science and magic were sort of twins at birth, that they both sought a certain kind of power, but that one worked with nature and the other worked, as it were, on nature and against nature rather than working with the spirits of nature. And it turned out to be the one that worked on nature was the one that produced results. So that's the path we went down. So I think he wanted to bring in Merlin as a figure to partly discuss his ideas about magic generally. I think he totally likes the idea that just as Arthur, in a sense, goes to Avalon and can return, so Merlin is put into this trance or this separate state by Nimue or Vivienne, depending on how you want to call her, but that there will be a time of his return. I tell you a really nice thing. When I was rereading Roger Lancelin Green and reading what he had to say about Merlin, so he talks about Merlin and Nimue and Merlin being put into the state of sleep or suspending, and actually right there in the book, he said, Lancelin Green, this book was published in like 52, maybe 53. He says, and whether he is, you know, on the Isle of Alderaan, or whether he sleeps under Bragdon Wood, who knows? He actually puts Bragdon Wood into his Arthur story, obviously, a kind of nod to his master Lewis, which I think is brilliant. I mean, it's a pity I didn't remember that from my childhood when I read That Hideous Strength, because it would have been so cool. I went, oh, Bragdon Wood, you know, it's kind of
yeah.
So yeah, I think he wanted to. Obviously, for the plot, Merlin becomes the vehicle whereby the planetary intelligences, the gods of the spheres, come down and extend power through him. And I get all of that. I think Merlin, I think he rouses, obviously literally awakes Merlin in the thing. And Merlin's a great character. There's a lot of mischief in, and Merlin mischievously going around the nice and pretending that it's the tramp, and they all think, and making all the scientists bow down to the tramp and everything. That's brilliant. I mean, that's great satire. But it's also, I can imagine Merlin. I like Merlin's character as Lewis does it. I really like, and also Lewis wants as a historian to tell us about change. So when Merlin says, "You give me this bath, which, you know, emperors would die for, but there's nobody to attend me," you know, and you know, it's like times have changed, mate. You know, so I like the magnificence of his Merlin, and I like the wit of his Merlin, and I like the sort of grim humor whereby Merlin sets about the destruction of the nice. I also like the idea that he gives Merlin, that Merlin would sometimes prophesy without knowing himself, and not sequentially with anything else, which he does all the time. So when he sees Mr. Bultitude the bear, he says, this bear is one of the 3 great bears of Logres, and will do a greater deed than any other bear has done, you know. And then he comes with, you know, I think that's great.
Yeah. In general, I think that that Lewis's space trilogy is underappreciated. I've always really just loved it. So
no, I think it's great. So anyway, and certainly the vision of the contrast between Logres, the kind of, we are both Logres and Britain, and, you know, really helped me to focus what I'm doing in my poem, and I want to recover Logres. Right. So in that sense, I mean, we've already mentioned all 4 Inklings, haven't we? Because I've talked about Tolkien.
Yes, we have.
I am listening to Tolkien, Charles Lund, and Barfield are all, if you like, progenitors in my mind of this project I'm doing now.
Wonderful. So one last question. You mentioned earlier that, you know, T.H. White's version is something that you kind of have mixed feelings about. Is there any version that is, in your mind, like so bad that you would tell people just not to read it? This one that you just despise?
Well, normally when I start on, I just don't go with it. So I'm not. To be frank, I haven't read a lot of modern versions at all.
Okay.
I read there's an interesting. There is a. I mean, I read. You know, back in the day, I read a Connecticut Yankee in the court of King Arthur.
Twain.
And again, I felt it was all to do with. It had that awful flaw, which I think is there in T.H. White as well, of a modern going back and being a bit snooty about the underdevelopment of the Middle Ages. To be fair on Twain, though, by the end of that book, he's kind of repenting of that a bit and realizing they had something that modern American society hasn't got. But I dislike all forms of sort of chronological snobbery, as Lewis called it, whereby, I mean, I hate it when, you know, people who want to be, you know, I mean, we've made many advances, it's fine. But to go back and tick an ancient author off for not being politically correct according to the mores of the 2020s is just a completely pointless and overweening thing to do.
Yeah, absolutely. So any final thoughts you'd like to share?
No, I mean, maybe I'm just wondering if I should close it with a little bit of poetry again.
Absolutely. Let's do that. That's the perfect way to end it.
I'm wondering if I can just give you a little sneak peek of, if I may get down to it, the sort of achievement of the Grail, and these three perspectives. I'll perhaps give you one of those perspectives. I think I've got a bit which picks up very much that. I mean, the thing you were saying is in Bulgakov, although I haven't read Bulgakov. So let me just see if I can find this pretty quickly. This is, I asked the question at the moment of the achievement, what did they see? Oh, each one saw as much as he could bear, and what some saw none else could see. Each saw part of the mystery, and after of their courtesy, they shared a little, tremblingly, of what befell them there. So I'm going to give you Percival's view of it, because just a few verses of it anyway. Sir Percival, from where he knelt, looked on in love and awe. His eyes were on the Holy Grail as Galahad did lift the veil. He spoke of it later, but words failed to utter all he saw. Then this is Percival speaking. The moment he removed the veil, I saw the chalice shine. Though silver, it seemed clear as glass, and through it I saw all things pass. All the earth gives, her living grass, her grain, her vines, her woods, her seas, all earthly things that fade and pass seem lifted in that living glass to meet the things divine, as though the Grail an isthmus were between the earth and heaven. Earth rose, but also heaven came down, and the whole Grail from stem to crown was where they met with glory crowned, and all of us on God's good ground seemed given and forgiven. Sometimes I felt I was in heaven, and yet still here on earth, for here I saw the wounded king, and there I heard the angels sing, yet here too did their music ring, and at the altar's corners four I saw what once I'd seen before, 4 living creatures who adore the Lamb upon the throne in awe. And now that Lamb indeed I saw, full in the wafer, held in awe by nation here on earth.
Oh, delightful.
So
thank you.
Just one
thank
of the
you.
three.
Really, thank you for sharing that. I really appreciate it. Well, Malcolm, I thank you so much for your time today. It's been a blessing to have you here at Grail Country. And I would be I have a co-host, Sherry. She has a farm, and she was not able to make it this morning because it conflicted with her farm chores. But at some point I would love to have you on at some point in the future to talk about George MacDonald, and Sherry would never forgive me if I didn't at least ask if you'd be open to that at some point in the future, because
I think at some point in the future, might not be this year, but yeah.
No, that's fine.
Yeah.
I appreciate it.
Okie doke. Great.
Take care.
Thank you.